Montana Territory, February 1882. The wind howled through the cracks in the station walls like it had something to say. Snow clung to the windows, and the old stove in the corner hissed and popped, throwing barely enough heat to warm the boots of the lone woman sitting on the bench. Wrapped in a gray wool shawl and holding a single carpetbag tight in her lap, Winnifred Langley kept her spine straight and her chin high, though her fingers trembled from the cold. She had been waiting for hours. A conductor passed through once with a tired nod, but no one else came. Not the man who had written her 3 letters. Not the man who was supposed to meet her here, at this nowhere station in the shadow of the Bitterroots, and take her to the farm he claimed needed a wife's hand. Winnifred was 27, and this was her last chance. She had buried her parents in Ohio, worked as a seamstress until her eyesight blurred, and finally answered a newspaper ad from a widower who wanted a woman who could cook and keep quiet. She told herself she did not need love. She only needed a roof, warmth, and someone to need her. But he was not coming. That much was clear now. The door slammed open, and a gust of snow swept in with a tall man in a worn trail coat, spurs clinking as he stepped inside. He pulled off his hat and beat the snow out of it, then dropped his eyes to her. Just one look. That was all it took. Winnifred met his gaze, startled. She had seen men look at her before, some with pity, some with empty charm, some with nothing at all. But this man looked right at her, like he had been searching. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice rough from the cold, but not unkind. She nodded, unsure what else to say. "A man named Tom McReady. He was supposed to meet the afternoon train." The cowboy stepped closer, his boots scuffing the old wood floor. He had dark hair, a strong jaw, and eyes like river stone, gray-green and steady. "I know Tom." He paused. "He ain't coming. He left 2 days ago with a woman from Helena. Married her quick. I figured I'd find someone here today. But I did not expect you." Winnifred blinked, tightening her grip on her bag. "You came for a woman?" He nodded. "Not through letters. I asked around town. My place is 20 miles north. I have a ranch, 2 young boys, and no one to help raise them. Their ma died last spring." He looked down, then back up. "I am not smooth with words, Mississippi. But I saw you and I knew." She stared at him, heart beginning to pound. "You were saying?" "I am saying," he said, stepping forward and offering his hand, "my name is Callum Lark. I have a warm fire, 2 sons who need a mother, and a heart that would be lucky to have you." Winnifred swallowed hard. Everything in her life had been cold and uncertain for so long. She had come here expecting something small and manageable. But this was something else entirely. "I do not know you," she whispered. "I know," Callum said. "But you will. And I reckon I will know you too. If you give me the chance." She looked at his hand. It was rough, calloused, and warm from the ride. Beyond the window, snow still fell in thick sheets. There was no other train until morning and nowhere else to go. "I do not have much," she said, voice shaking. "Neither do I," he said, crouching in front of her. "But I have enough. And I am not going to leave you sitting here alone." Something in his words broke open a quiet place in her chest. Not love yet, but safety. A beginning. She placed her hand in his. Callum stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "My wagon is outside. It will be rough riding, but I brought extra blankets." She nodded, following him out into the storm. The snow hit her like a slap, but Callum helped her into the wagon before she could shiver too hard. He wrapped her in a thick buffalo coat, then climbed up beside her, setting the reins in his gloves. "You will meet Nathaniel and Nora when we get home," he said, guiding the horses onto the snow-packed trail. "Nathaniel is 7. Nora is 5. She still cries for her ma sometimes, but she is strong." Winnifred leaned into the warmth beside her, watching the trees blur past in the white. "They have someone to cry for. That is more than I had for a long time." Callum turned toward her, his jaw softening. "Maybe this is our second chance." The ride was long and cold, but he never let go of the reins, never let the horses slow more than needed. He talked a little about the land, about how he taught Nathaniel to ride, and how Nora liked to draw birds in the dirt. When they reached the ranch, the log house glowed warm behind a split rail fence dusted in snow. Smoke curled from the chimney. 2 little faces pressed to the window, eyes wide. "Go on inside," Callum said, hopping down to unhitch the horses. "I will be there in a minute." Winnifred stepped into the house. her boots thawing against the stone hearth. The children stared at her. "You are real," Nathaniel said, blinking. Nora held a rag doll close to her chest. "Are you going to leave like the other one did?" Winnifred knelt by the fire, pulling off her gloves. "No," she said softly, "I am not going anywhere." Callum came in, snow melting on his shoulders. He looked at the children, then at her. "She is staying," he said, voice sure. And just like that, Winnifred Langley, who had sat waiting in a cold station, heart nearly frozen with doubt, was claimed not by the man who had written her, but by the one who had looked at her and seen something worth holding on to. The warmth in the room was not just from the fire. It came from the way Callum watched her, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel it. Hope. The morning came slow and pale over the ridge, light pressing through the frost-laced window panes and laying soft across the plank floor. Winnifred stood by the stove, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the scent of cornmeal rising from the skillet. She had found the flour tin tucked behind the bean jar, the lard solid as stone in the cold box, and the cast iron pans clean and hung in a neat row. The kitchen spoke of use, not neglect, and she moved through it with quiet purpose, her body remembering old rhythms long left behind in Ohio. Behind her, small feet padded across the floor. Nora climbed onto a stool without a word, her doll tucked in the crook of one arm. Winnifred turned just enough to offer her a gentle look, then flipped the cake and pressed the edge with her spatula, testing the crust. "There's honey," Nora said after a long pause. "Papa keeps it in the blue crock near the salt." Winnifred nodded. "Thank you, Nora." The child studied her with round, guarded eyes. "Do you know how to sew?" "I do." Nora's fingers moved along the hem of her nightdress. "Mama made this. I want to keep it even when it gets holes. I can mend it without changing it." The girl's shoulders eased just enough to be noticed. Winnifred slid a cake onto a plate and set it in front of her, then turned as the door opened and Callum stepped in, brushing snow from his sleeves. He paused when he saw them both. "Smells like someone knows what they're doing," he said, voice still edged with the cold. "I didn't know what your boys would eat, so I made what I could manage." Callum hung his coat, then crossed to the basin and washed his hands, the pump handle creaking. "That's more than fair. Nathaniel's out feeding the chickens. He'll come in when his cheeks go red." "I can warm the cakes again," she offered. "No need." He dried his hands and turned toward her. "You settle all right last night?" "I did," she said, aware of the way his gaze lingered. "The children's room is warmer than I expected." He nodded. "I patched the north wall before the first frost. Still gets drafty when the wind's up." Nora dipped a finger into her honey and licked it, then looked at Callum. "She said she can fix Mama's dress." His eyes met Winnifred's. "That's kind of you. I'd like to be useful." "You already are." She looked away, pretending to check the skillet again. "I'd like to see the rest of the place, if you don't mind. Soon as Nathaniel's in and fed, I'll take you out to the barn and the pasture edge. It's not grand, but it's ours." Winnifred nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. "And schooling? Do they have books?" "A few. I taught Nathaniel his letters. He's got a head for numbers. Nora wants to read like her brother, but I haven't had the time to do it right." "I could help," she offered, watching him closely. "If they're willing. They'll come to you. Might take a little time." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The warmth in her chest was slow building, but steady. Not love, not yet, but the beginnings of something rooted. Nathaniel came in then, boots stomping and cheeks flushed. He glanced at Winnifred, then at his father, and made a beeline for the wash basin. He said nothing until he was seated, then picked at his breakfast with one hand and reached for the honey with the other. "I saw the fox tracks again," he said between bites. "Same ones as last week." Callum grunted. "Might be denning near the creek. I'll take a look later." Winnifred leaned on the counter. "Do you ever trap them?" Nathaniel looked up, surprised by the question. "Papa says we only trap what we need. Otherwise we just watch." "Smart rule," she said. The boy blinked, then nodded and resumed eating. By mid-morning, The sun had burned the frost off the fence rails, and Winnifred followed Callum past the stacked woodpile and out to the barn. The horses shifted in their stalls, and she noticed the careful order of tack and tools. Nothing wasted, nothing left idle. "You built all this?" she asked, stepping over a frozen rut. "My father started it," he said. "I finished what I could after he passed. Still needs work." She ran her fingers along the edge of a beam. "It's solid. You've done well." He stopped beside her. "I didn't expect to bring someone home yesterday. I didn't even plan to go to the station. But when I saw you there, sitting so still, I knew." She turned to face him, the barn quiet around them. "I hadn't planned on saying yes to anyone either," she said. "But I looked at you and I didn't feel afraid." His face shifted, something deeper moving behind his eyes. "I won't push," he said. "You're here now and that's enough for me. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." She held his gaze a moment longer, then looked toward the hills. The snow had begun to melt in streaks along the slope, revealing patches of brown grass and rock. "Spring's not far off," she said. "No. And when it comes, there'll be calves. A lot of work." "I've done hard work before." Callum smiled, faint and true. "I believe you." They stood there a while longer, neither speaking, the silence not empty, but full with the shape of something still forming. When they walked back to the house, the children's laughter spilled from the doorway, and the warmth inside no longer felt borrowed. Felt like the beginning of a life. The first Sunday after Winnifred arrived, the sky stretched open and wide, pale blue with no trace of snow. The trail to the chapel was rutted and half-thawed, but Callum hitched the wagon early, brushing the horses down with steady hands as Winnifred helped Nora into her boots near the hearth. Nathaniel stood by the door, hat in hand, fidgeting with the brim. "Do they still sing?" he asked, not looking at anyone. "They do," Callum said, stepping inside to take up his vest from the peg. "And if the preacher hasn't changed his ways, he'll talk too long about hard work and not enough about mercy." Winnifred pulled her shawl tighter. "I remember the hymns better than the sermons. They stay in your bones." Nora reached for Winnifred's hand without speaking. The quiet gesture stayed with her all the way down the muddy trail, past the bare cottonwoods and the fence lines still bent from winter's weight. The chapel rose plain and square from the crest above the stream, its whitewash dulled by wind and sun. A bell hung crooked over the door, silent for now. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and lamp oil. The benches were rough-hewn, the floor swept clean. A few families had already gathered, heads turning when Callum entered, then again when Winnifred stepped in beside him. She felt the weight of their eyes but kept her chin level, settling between Nathaniel and Nora near the stove. "Who's the woman?" a man whispered from the back. "She's his now, I reckon," came the reply. Winnifred kept her gaze forward. The preacher rose, gaunt and red-eyed, and opened his Bible with fingers worn thin at the tips. He spoke of the flood in Genesis, about how Noah had to believe in something he couldn't yet see. Winnifred listened, not for the scripture, but for the tone of it, for the way the words pressed at the places in her heart that still felt unsure. After the final hymn, she stepped outside into the warming air. Children rushed past, chasing each other through the brush. Callum stood near the wagon, speaking low with a man whose boots were caked in mud. Nathaniel lingered by the corner post, carving a notch with his thumbnail. A woman approached, her dress neat, her hair pinned in a coil that had taken time. "You're the one he brought down from the station." Winnifred nodded. "That's right." The woman studied her without blinking. "I was sorry to hear about Lily. She was kind to everyone, even when she was sick. I'm not here to replace her." "Good," the woman said, "because she can't be replaced. But those children, they need someone steady. You look steady." "I try to be." The woman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I'm Ruth Hemley. We're half a mile west, near the sugar pines. If you ever need a needle, or fresh eggs, or just a place to sit that isn't full of questions, come by." Winnifred offered her hand. Ruth shook it, firm and brief, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. On the ride home, Nora leaned against Winnifred's arm and dozed. Nathaniel sat up front, beside Callum, asking about the fence posts near the creek that had started to lean. Callum glanced over his shoulder. "You all right?" "I am." "Ruth talked to you?" "She did. She was Lily's cousin. She watches close, but she means well. She offered me thread and a place to sit. That's more than most did." He nodded, turning the reins gently. "You didn't have to come today. I wanted to see the shape of the world here." "And what did you see?" She looked out across the plain, where red hawks circled high and the creek caught the light just enough to glint. "Something that might grow," she said. That night, Callum brought in a paper-wrapped parcel from the wagon. He laid it on the table and unwrapped it slow. Inside lay a pair of leather gloves, new stitched and lined with wool. "I traded for them last week," he said. "Didn't know if you'd still be here. But I figured I'd rather be wrong than unprepared." Winnifred touched the soft lining with careful fingers. "They're too fine for what I do. They're not for work. They're for when you walk out in the morning and the frost bites hard. I don't want you cold." She met his eyes across the table, the lantern light catching the lines near his mouth, the ones that hadn't been there 10 years ago. "I've been cold before," she said. "But not here." He didn't answer, just nodded and poured water into the kettle with a steady hand. She watched the way he moved, the quiet he carried even in small things, and something inside her began to settle in a way it hadn't for years, not with the seamstress table, not with the empty room in her parents' house, not even on the train west. She slid the gloves on, flexed her fingers. "They fit," she said. Callum looked up from the stove. "I hoped they would." By late March, the thaw reached the lower pasture. The ground turned soft underfoot, slick with meltwater and the smell of turned earth. Winnifred rose before first light each morning, her hands already knowing their way through the kitchen without need for thought. She no longer felt like she was stepping into someone else's routine. Each task had become her own. On a Tuesday morning, Callum returned from the far field with a fresh gash along his forearm, the torn sleeve dark with blood and mud. Winnifred caught him at the porch, her voice low and sharp. "What happened?" He looked down as if just noticing it. "Fence gave under me. Wire snapped back. Sit down." "Now." She grabbed a basin and clean cloths before he could answer. Callum eased onto the stool beside the hearth as she knelt in front of him. He didn't flinch as she poured the cooled water over the wound, but his jaw tensed when she dabbed at the edges. Her fingers moved quickly, her breath steady. "You didn't tie it off?" she asked. "I meant to. Tools were half a mile back, and I thought I could finish without them." "You can't think like that anymore." His brow lifted. "Anymore? You've got 2 children and someone who notices when you don't come in on time." She wrung out the cloth and pressed it firm to slow the bleeding. "You don't get to be careless." He studied her, the lines at the corners of his eyes softening. "You're right. I know." He chuckled, quiet and low. "You always talk this sharp when you're scared?" She didn't answer, just reached for the salve and began smoothing it along the clean wound. Her touch turned gentler now that the bleeding had slowed. "I used to help the doctor in our town when I could," she said. "He let me stitch when his hands got too stiff. Said I had a steady way about me." "You do." "I wasn't asking for praise. I'm giving it anyway." She tied off the bandage with a firm knot, then sat back on her heels. "You'll need to keep it dry," she said. "I'll manage." He looked down at her hands, still red from the effort. "You didn't have to do all that. I wasn't going to let it fester." He watched her another moment, then reached out with his good hand and traced a line of flour across her cheek with his thumb. "You've got a way of making this place feel more like something I might deserve." She stood slowly. "It's not about deserving. It's about choosing what needs to be held onto." That night, Nathaniel brought her a bird's nest he'd found fallen near the creek, a tangle of grass and horsehair, still whole despite the fall. He placed it on the table without a word, then turned and went back outside. Winnifred touched the rim lightly, feeling the weight of it. Callum came in behind her. He doesn't say much when he means something. She looked up at him, her voice quiet. I know how that feels. He leaned against the doorway, his bandaged arm resting across his chest. I never asked what brought you west. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She glanced toward the window where the moonlight struck silver across the packed trail that wound down toward the creek. My family's gone, she said. No siblings, no cousins worth writing to. The shop I worked in was sold to a man who didn't take kindly to women over 25. I had some savings. Enough for the train. I didn't want to fade into a rooming house with no one knowing I'd ever been there. Callum nodded once. You haven't faded here. She met his eyes, steady and sure. I don't intend to. The next morning, he left early to check the herd. Before he went, he paused at the door, his hat in one hand. You'll be all right with the children for a few hours? She nodded. We're going to start on penmanship. Nora wants to write her name like Nathaniel does. He smiled faintly. That'll be something to see. She stepped closer, brushing a loose bit of hay from his collar. You'll be back before supper? I always come home. He lingered a heartbeat longer than needed, then stepped out into the morning. After he left, she brought the children to the table and spread out the few sheets of lined paper they had. Nora gripped the pencil too tight, tongue between her teeth, and Nathaniel offered corrections with the solemnity of a schoolmaster. By midday, the wind shifted, bringing the scent of damp pine and distant rain. Winnifred stood in the doorway watching the clouds gather over the western ridge. She felt the weight of the house behind her and the small sounds within it, pages turning, a kettle singing low, Nora humming something half-remembered. The nest still sat on the table. She hadn't moved it. Outside, the first drops began to fall. She didn't step back and right away. She watched the trail instead, waiting for the shape of a man on horseback to rise out of the trees. And when he did, wet coat drawn tight, horse lathered but sound, she felt something in her bones settle into place. He rode straight for the porch, dismounted in one smooth motion, and looked up at her through the veil of rain. I told you I'd come back. She stepped aside to let him in. You always will, she said. The creek had risen with the melt, its banks soft and pocked with deer tracks. Winnifred stood beneath the cottonwood, hem of her dress tucked high, a basket of early dandelion greens on her arm. The light came through the branches in thin golden strands, warm on her face. Nearby, Nora crouched beside a moss-slick rock, whispering to a frog she'd coaxed into her palm. Nathaniel was farther upstream, tossing pebbles and watching the ripples stretch across the water. Callum's voice carried from the rise above. You'll lose the bottom of your boots in that mud if you stay too long. Winnifred looked up, shielding her eyes. Then you'll just have to carry me back. He descended the hill with a slow, easy gait, favoring the side where his arm still healed. His shirt sleeves were rolled and he carried a bundle of fence wire under one arm. You're asking the man with one arm to haul you through a bog? I thought you liked a challenge. He stopped beside her, his free hand brushing a strand of hair from her temple. Only if the reward's worth it. She tilted her head. And is it? His voice dropped, low and certain. Every time. The children stayed by the water while Callum and Winnifred walked back toward the house, the basket swinging lightly between them. At the edge of the field, he paused. I've been thinking, he said, scanning the wide stretch of grass and the slope beyond. There's room for a garden here. Something proper. Tomatoes, beans, maybe some squash. I could turn the soil with the mule team by end of week. She rested her hand on his arm. I'd like that. He nodded. And behind the barn, there's a patch of flat ground. I could put up a chicken shed. If you want hens again. She smiled, the kind that started slow and stayed. I do. They stood a while longer, the breeze lifting the scent of wet earth and pine. Then Callum cleared his throat, reaching into his pocket. What he pulled out was no larger than a walnut shell, a small carved ring, pale wood polished smooth from handling. I made this, he said, out of the first stump beside the well. It's not gold, but it's strong. I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right day. Winnifred looked at the ring, then at him. I didn't plan on asking like this, he said. But nothing about us was ever planned, and I don't want to wait. She didn't speak, only held out her hand. Callum slid the ring onto her finger. It fit snug, like it had always been meant for her. They said nothing more. There was no need. That night, Nathaniel and Nora sat cross-legged by the hearth, watching Winnifred sew a patch onto Nathaniel's trousers. Callum leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes on all three of them. Nathaniel broke the silence. Are you going to marry her now? Callum's voice was calm. Yes. Nora didn't look up from her doll. Will she stay forever? Winnifred folded the finished trousers and stood. I'm not going anywhere. That spring, they wed in the meadow behind the house. Ruth Hemley brought her best pie, and a preacher from 3 Valleys over read from a leather-bound book so old the corners curled like dried leaves. Nora wore a wreath of hawthorn, and Nathaniel held the reins of the mule team with solemn pride. Winnifred wore the same blue dress she'd arrived in, the hem now mended and let down, the sleeves freshened by her own hand. She didn't need lace or silk. She had Callum's hands in hers, the children beside them, and the land stretching wide around them, green and waiting. By midsummer, the garden had taken root. Winnifred rose early to water the rose, her hands dark with soil, her hair pinned loose beneath a sunbonnet. Callum worked the far pastures with Nathaniel trailing behind, learning the rhythm of hoof and fence line. Nora helped feed the hens, naming each one and singing to them as she scattered seed. Some evenings, when the light lingered long and the air turned soft with crickets and the smell of clover, Winnifred and Callum walked the edge of the property, fingers intertwined, saying little. I never thought I'd have this, she said once, voice barely above the hum of the wind. Callum kissed the crown of her head. I always hoped. The seasons turned. The children grew taller, their laughter louder. Callum's hair grayed at the temples. Winnifred's hands grew stronger, her steps sure. They built a life not from grand gestures or promises, but from steady work and quiet devotion. And when the first snow of the next winter fell, Winnifred stood at the window, the fire warm at her back, the ring on her finger catching the light. She turned as Callum came in from the barn, shaking snow from his shoulders. He stepped close, pulled her into his arms, and held her there. You're home, she said. Always, he answered. And he was.